morning. We are back again, and we want to continue our discussion of America at the turn of the century. That was an old song that I used to know when I grew up, when I was younger. It went, how could something so good be so bad? And in many ways, I think that captures what the paradox of America at the turn of the century, certainly as it pertains to big business. No one could argue that the Industrial Revolution was not one of the most important phenomena in American history. The incredible technological and industrial growth helped America achieve a place second to none in the world. Indeed, there was much to be proud of. There was much in terms of praise that one could give to the industrial captains of industry at the turn of the century. And yet, as we will see in a moment, despite all the good, despite where it took America in its place in the world, the Industrial Revolution in its wake created problems that had to be solved by the progressive movement at the turn of the century. Perhaps if we wanted to try to analyze what went wrong, we might look at perhaps the nature of power itself. No matter how well-intentioned the Andrew Carnegies, the John D. Rockefellers, the J. Piermont Morgans were, power has an intoxicating influence. It is that old saying that power corrupts, and absolute power corrupts absolutely. Perhaps it was that, and it was also the belief, a fundamental belief inherent in the Constitution and how America evolved, that indeed property, business, that there was something sacred about property that was both equal and fundamental to both God and justice. In other words, private property was sacred and was sacred. You could not interfere with the rights of those who own property. And perhaps that too helps create the problems that farmers face, the problems that labor, the problems that cities will encounter as a result of the Industrial Revolution. Because indeed, as we looked last time, farmers began to chafe at the practice of rate discrimination. It was not so much that rate discrimination was again directed as a punitive measure somehow on the part of big business, but rate discrimination was a tool used by businessmen in what? Their competition with their fellow entrepreneurs. That rate discrimination was a device that allowed them to undercut their competitors, to drive them out of business, as we looked, because all of a sudden it became apparent that competition free and unfettered competition was not all that it was cracked up to be. And so as a result, there was this increasing belief on the part of big business that consolidation was best. That smaller businesses, if they could not survive on their own, should not survive. That monopolies brought about stability, brought about greater efficiency, could serve a greater number of people. So perhaps while these individuals did not sit down in a smoke-filled room somewhere to plot against the farmers, nonetheless the farmers got caught up in the competition between railroads and businesses. And so rate discrimination was used as a tool in pushing competitors out, but hurt the farmers and those who ship goods on the railroads. Farmers, as I indicated, tried a number of ways to fight back. In the 1870s, you had the growth of farmer alliances. You had the Northern Farmers Alliance. You had the Western Farmers Alliance. You had the Southern Farmers Alliance. And because of discrimination, you had the Colored Farmers Alliance because it was not allowed to join the Colored Farmers Alliance. The Farmers Alliances had two things in common in terms of how they would meet the challenge of rate discrimination, of what they considered the oppression of big business. One was education. They believed that if the farmer could be educated to the changing ways of business, if they could adopt the practices and strategies of big business, they too could succeed. So many were taught that they had the linchpin of big business was mass production, increasing the supply to serve a bigger market. And so farmers did that. They also believed that not just education would help them, but they needed to pool their resources to create cooperatives in various industries. This was particularly effective in Wisconsin, in the dairy industry. There, dairy farmers created cooperatives and were modestly successful. But for the majority of farmers, during the late 1870s and into the 1880s, the farmers' alliances didn't seem to hold the answer for them. By the 1880s, farmers were going into greater and greater debt. One farm after another was taken over by the bank, was foreclosed on. Farmers lost their homes, their land. In the 1880s, suddenly farmers believed that it would not simply be education or cooperatives that would save them from the ravages of big business, but political action. As one radical feminist farmer put it in the 1880s, it was time to raise less corn and more hell. So as a result, by 1892, farmers believe that the only way that they are going to be able to find a voice that will address their issues would be through political action. But not just local political action, because you had that. In the 1870s, the Grange was a political action agrarian movement. The Grange that tried to limit the rates on the storage of grain elevators in Chicago to punish the railroads who owned 80% of the grain elevators. So you had some attempt at political organization in the late 1870s, but it did not work. Now, many farmers believe that they had to create a national third party, because neither the Republican nor the Democratic Party, and certainly they felt it was a Democratic Party who should have looked after their needs. The Democratic Party had turned their back on the farmers, and Republicans were only interested in industrialism. So as the farmers met in Omaha, Nebraska, to create the Populist Party under the leadership of Thomas Watson, they called for the mobilization of farmers to put a farmer in the White House. You can see from an excerpt of their platform in 1892 what the farmers felt. A vast conspiracy against mankind has been organized on 2 continents, and it is rapidly taking possession of the world. If not met and overthrown at once, it forebodes terrible social convulsions, the destruction of civilization, or the establishment of an absolute despotism. We have witnessed for more than a quarter of a century the 2 great political parties struggling for power and plunder, while grievous wrongs have been inflicted upon the people. We charge that the controlling influences of both parties have permitted the dreadful existing conditions to develop without any serious effort to restrain them. Neither do they now promise us any substantial reform. They have agreed together in the upcoming national campaign to ignore every issue but one. They propose to drown the outcries of a plundered people with the uproar of a sham battle over the tariff, so that the capitalists, the corporations, the national banks, the rings, the trust, the watered stock, the oppression of the usurer may all be lost sight of. They propose to sacrifice our homes, our lives, and our children on the altar of mammon, to destroy the multitude in order to secure corrupt funds from the millionaires. Well, the populists, in spite of this fire in their belly were not successful. They created the third party in 1892 at Omaha, but third parties are not successful in American national politics. So, in the end, the farmers would enter the 20th century with problems that were still yet unsolved and still looking for a solution to rate discrimination and the other abuses. But the farmers were not alone in having reservations about this new industrial order and how they had been adversely affected by it. Labor, too, had its grievances against big business. Now you understand why big business was so interested in getting protection of the 14th Amendment. There were a lot of people angry at big business, in spite of the fact that most Americans understood that it was doing good as well. It's this paradox. But labor began to try to find a voice to express their discontent during the Industrial Revolution. The one thing I think it should be pointed out about the laboring classes in America, both during the 1870s and as we move into the 20th century, that these were not lazy people. America's laborers have always been tremendously hard workers. The immigrants who would come from foreign countries like yours were used to hard work. They were no stranger to hard work, nor were they adverse to hard work. Americans who left the small farms in the wake of the railroads, who often turned small towns into dust and had to head for the big cities for jobs, they too were not strangers to hard work, and they were not opposed to hard work. But there was something different about the nature of hard work in these factories that blossomed during the Gilded Age, the Industrial Revolution. Working in factories was very different than working on the farms, whether in Europe, in Lithuania, as Jurgis, in the jungle, or in a small farm in Tennessee or Alabama. The difference is that no matter how little a farmer made, a farmer still felt, and no matter how hard he worked from sun up to sundown, there was still a personal sense of what? Of self-worth, of dignity. As an individual. As a recognizable individual. But working in the factories was something different. Not only was the work long, tedious, monotonous, and hard, but the workers really were looked upon less as valued individuals and more as simply clogs in this economic wheel that churned and turned and didn't stop. The monotony. For the first time, you had masses of people who sat at a job and did the same thing over and over again. Repetition. This repetition led to a kind of carelessness, which resulted in the loss of limbs and illnesses. Again, the jungle illustrates that. Sometimes, if you've ever driven in a car, and after a while, if you've driven so long, you become almost hypnotized by the road if you're not careful, if you don't vary the routine. This happened to laborers. And when they were hurt and they could not continue, what was the attitude of those who owned the businesses? You just go out and you find someone else. Because there was always what? Someone else who wanted a job. Because it is a period where millions of people are now rushing to the cities to find jobs in the factory. So it was not difficult to find a worker. People were lined up for it. I mean, again, in fact, it's almost this tremendous competition that even in some places you had to even buy your job. And you had to give a little to the foreman or the employer to even get the job. And then sometimes after that you had to give them a part of your pay. It was a difficult time for workers. When Jurgis was injured, and Sinclair makes that point because Jurgis is a what? I mean, he purposely creates Jurgis as a character who can bring home this point that no matter how big, no matter how muscular, no matter how powerful you are, you may be more powerful than the other men that you work with, but you're no match for the system, which will grind him up the same way that will grind up anybody else. The system, that becomes important. The system, because that we'll see as the muckrakers attack the system in some of their writings. So, what do the workers do? Most workers, by the way, will never join unions. Certainly not at this time. It is always a few. And at the outset, the few had to be fairly courageous. The first significant attempt by labor to organize was in 1869, the Knights of Labor. The Knights of Labor, I think, in many ways was sort of cute in a way when you look back on it, because it certainly bears no resemblance to labor unions today. Indeed, the Knights of Labor was originally established by Uriah Stevens, a minister. What's the minister doing involved in trying to create a union? He had been a teacher, he had been a minister, and he decided, though, that the workers deserved better. That the workers deserved better working conditions and shorter hours of being forced to work. But his strategy of achieving this with big business failed. His strategy was to utilize something called moral suasion. Moral persuasion. And I think that's probably appropriate for a minister to use such a tactic. Because what was moral suasion? What you simply did was you organized the union. And the Knights of Labor was organized this way. One, it was an industrial-based union, which was also one of its weaknesses. An industrial-based union welcomed all workers, skilled or unskilled. They welcomed women. They made a concerted effort to bring blacks into the unions in the South, the Knights of Labor, which was in itself unprecedented. The demands were simple: shorter working hours and better wages. And the way that they would do it is that they would simply go to the employer and prevail upon his sense of justice and right. To morally persuade him by simply, look, Mr. So-and-so, Charlie wants to work hard. He wants to work. He's a good worker. But he can't feed his family on the salary, on the wages that you give him an hour. They're working too hard. They can't get home. The long hours are taking a toll on our workers' health. Surely, as a Christian, you can understand this. Surely I can touch you morally, and you will then do what? See that you have to do what's right. Not. As someone just said, not. It's not quite the way that it worked. Eventually, the Knights of Labor will find out that the only way, if there's any way, to be successful against big business, because they didn't feel they owed workers anything. They didn't owe them benefits. And how dare a labor union tell me what I should do, no matter how nice you tell me. Because those who owned businesses and companies and factories believed that they were private property, it belonged to them, and they should and could run it any way that they wanted. So eventually, under the leadership of Terence Powderly, the Knights of Labor will experience some successes during the 1880s. But by 1886, the Knights of Labor as a union has stalled. It has stalled primarily because employers can break strikes, particularly when they involved unskilled and skilled workers. It fails because, excuse me, in 1886, you have the Chicago riot that results from the strike at the McCormick Harvester Works in 1886. A riot that had been started by not a union worker, not a Knights of Labor individual, but by an avowed anarchist by the name of August Spies. Boy, what a perfect name to be an anarchist. If you're going to be an anarchist, have the name Spies. As the workers struck in 1886 against the McCormick Harvester Works in Chicago and Haymarket Square, it's called the Haymarket Square riot actually, you had August Spies urging, inciting workers to strike to bring down capitalism. Well, you know what happens when you get a bunch of workers and they're whipped up, and then the Chicago police were brought out to contain, to make sure nothing happens. That's a bad what? That's a bad combination. Or in the drug industry, that's a bad interaction. And what happens is that at that moment, someone decides, oh, what a great time to throw a bomb in the middle of this mess. And someone does. And then the police do what they've been trained, or actually not trained to do in terms of riot control at this time, was to fire on anything that moved. and 7 policemen were killed. Later on, we find out that they shot each other. Everybody ducked but them, and they shot each other. I mean, but spies and a number of others are executed. And the newspapers decry not only August Spies, who is an anarchist and not a union person, but they also criticize the Knights of Labor. They also criticize the entire concept that men can demand that that an owner negotiate with them about wages and about hours. It was an assault on the fundamental basis of the American free enterprise system. And so Americans turned against the Knights of Labor, and they simply disappeared. But in their wake, at the same time, in the same year that you had, and it's interesting, in the same year that you had both the peaking of the Knights of Labor and its demise, you had the emergence of a labor union that would be with us right down to today. But a labor union that, to some extent, was far smarter than the Knights of Labor. Or at least they understood that if they were going to be successful, they had to change the way that the union operated. The American Federation of Labor, the AF-L, was established in 1888 by Adolphus Strausser, but he's less important, Adolphus Strausser, than Samuel Gompers, who would take the American Federation of Labor reorganize it, and under his leadership, it will be able to win some modest victories against employers. Well, what's different about the American Federation of Labor and the Knights of Labor? What did they do right that the Knights of Labor did wrong? For one, Gompers clearly saw that you could always do what? You could always replace unskilled labor. They were the easiest element in the labor force to replace. So we need to exclude them from the labor unions. We want to make it harder if we strike for employers to be able to replace us. So the way you do that is you create a highly specialized labor union, a union composed of crafts and skills. But not only do you get rid of the unskilled labor and you create a union of crafts and skills, but you exercise birth control, in a sense. Supply and demand. You can control through apprenticeship programs how many Boilermakers, how many engineers, how many skilled people you want to do what? To be certified out of a certain craft or guild. Why was this important? Because if there was a strike and the owner fired this skilled person, there would not be many for him to be able to what? To use to replace him. So they kept the numbers low. They were highly trained. They were also, it was also a union that created a very impressive dues-paying fund that would allow them to survive during a time of strikes. But even this, But even with the successes of the American Federation of Labor, these successes are really pretty minuscule. Organized labor makes a relatively small dent in improving the lot for most workers. It will be, interestingly, not labor unions that will provide some improvement. It will be, in fact, people who are, in fact, sort of anti-labor who will come to their aid and find ways to pass laws to improve the lot of the workers, the progressives that I'll talk about in a moment. But until then, this was what labor was like in a sweatshop. This is a poem that described working conditions at the turn of the century. The clock in the workshop, it rests not a moment. It points on and ticks on. Eternity, time. Once someone told me the clock had a meaning, and pointing and ticking had a reason and a rhyme. At times when I listen, I hear the clock plainly. The reason of old, the old meaning, is gone. The maddening pendulum urges me forward to labor and still labor on. The tick of the clock is the boss in his anger. The face on the clock has the eyes of the foe. The clock, I shudder. Thus here it draws me. It calls me machine, and it cries to me, so. In other words, work. And that would be the lot of the worker for many years. But we'll see the progressives again trying to make some improvements. The other, certainly, area in which the Industrial Revolution had an impact on was the cities. As the railroads grew, small towns, many of them disappeared, as I'd indicated. Because of that, young people could not find jobs and had to leave the farms, the small towns, and head for the cities in the Midwest and the East. Cities like Milwaukee, who by the turn of the century had become known as the beer capital of the world. Chicago had become known by 1900 as the slaughterhouse, the hog capital of the world. Pittsburgh, the steel capital of the world. But clearly, though, the city that captured the imagination of most people was New York City, which was the center of both intellectual and financial and industrial life in America at the turn of the century. Cities, let me state in defense of big business that from the beginning, from this country's inception, cities have always had problems. The character of those problems had not been created by big business. If we read Carl Bradenbach's book, Cities in the Wilderness, and as he looks at the first 5 original cities in America, we can see, though not to the extent that we will have at the turn of the century, we will see the same problems. Congestion, poverty, crime, even corruption. And then there's always the problems of social ills. Prostitution is as old as America itself. These were problems that were dealt with, that Americans had to deal with in the 18th century, the 19th century, and they would be problems that Americans would have to deal with in the 20th century. It's just that once you had this sudden upsurge of immigrants into the cities, the problems became what? Massive. For instance, because of the great influx between the 1880s and 1900, this influx of immigrants, there were two new sources of labor that helped create this congestion in the cities. One was, as I indicated, Americans, Anglo-Saxon Americans, who left the farms. And sometimes they didn't leave because a train had simply bypassed their small town, deprived it of vital services, and therefore it went out of business. Sometimes that was a fascination about the cities. That people often thought the cities were a very interesting place to go. And certainly as they heard by word of mouth the wages that were being paid by companies in the cities. Any literature on the cities reflects a kind of love-hate relationship with the cities. All the way from as far back as you can go. I mean, people are attracted to the cities, and yet they are often repulsed by the cities because of all the things that go on in the cities. Its glamour and its sort of lewdness and sometimes downright filth. I mean, people who go to New York always tell you what, it's a great place to visit, but I wouldn't want to live there. That is the kind of attitude that Americans have always had toward the cities. This is the personal motivation of one young lady who wanted to go to the city. She wanted to roam, so she left the old home. The old people's hearts were sore. She longed for the sights and the bright city lights, where hundreds had gone before. She went to the heart of the city and mingled with strangers there. But nobody said, "You are being misled." For what did the stranger care? In the heart of the city that has no heart, that's where they meet and that's where they part. The current of vice had proved too strong, so the poor little girlie just drifted along. Nobody cared if she lived or died. Nobody cared if she laughed or cried. She's just lost a sister, and nobody's missed her. She's there in the city where there's no pity, in the city that has no heart. Sort of a, geez, makes you feel kind of bad. But indeed, in many ways, that is what the city was like. For that one group, the old stock Anglo-Saxon Americans who moved to the city for either opportunity because they had no choice, and secondly, a new wave, sometimes referred to by historians as the new immigration, principally between the period 1880 and 1915. Immigrants who came from southern and eastern European countries. These immigrants, by virtue of how different they were, in itself created problems for the cities. And not only because they added to the congestion, but these individuals were regarded as very different by Americans who considered themselves Anglo-Saxon Americans. They were not the same. Culturally, they were different. They had a different culture, they had a different religion, and what was even worse, some of these Southern and Eastern European immigrants didn't seem to want to what? To change, to adapt American core conformity. Instead, some seemed to go out of their way, many Americans argued, to be different. They wanted to transplant the heresy of this. They wanted to transplant their own homes here in America. So what you have is little Italies, little Chinatowns, Jewish enclaves. These were people who were considered different from most Americans for the first 2 or 3 generations. The Italians were particularly maligned and stereotyped. The Italians who were often described as dark, swarthy kind of individuals. And these were people, and the women had to be concerned about the Italian men who had a reputation for, shall we say, a certain prowess when it came to women. They were, this idea of they were good at amour. And it's because at first, most of the Italian men who came to America did not come to actually live, to bring families. They came at first simply to make money, to send money back to Italy. Indeed, ironically, the first major international controversy the U.S. will have with a foreign country toward the end of the century will be involving Italian citizens. In all places, New Orleans, Louisiana, in 1891. Now you wonder, what could happen in New Orleans, Louisiana in 1891 that could create an international crisis between the U.S. and Italy? Well, in 1891, what happened was that apparently the Black Hand Society, which was a group that immigrated from Sicily, and Americans never made the distinction between Sicilians and Italians. I mean, they were all the same in the eyes of Americans. So these Italians, these Sicilians, carried on vendettas against one another that they had happened often in the old country. And at one point in carrying out a vendetta, a sheriff got in the way and got killed. Well, the good people in New Orleans wanted justice. So they had arrested 11 Italian citizens, the first 11 they saw. They arrested them, and they were being held in jail for safekeeping, but that was not enough. 2,000 of the good citizens of New Orleans in 1891 marched on to the jailhouse, and in a derisive, pejorative accent, called out to the police to, give them the Italians, those who had killed the chief. Well, and this was led by the mayor, by the way, of New Orleans. And they did. They gave them to the people, and they promptly lynched them. The Italian government was upset. Truly, it was upset. How could they do this to Italian citizens? And they sent saber-rattling notes to the American Secretary of State, James G. Blaine, who was nicknamed Jingle Jim Blaine because he was the kind of Secretary of State who liked to go to war, or at least he boasted he would go to war at the drop of a pen. Well, Blaine investigated and found out that only 2 of the 11 had not been naturalized Italian Americans. Only 2 were not citizens. So he wrote back to the Italian government that sure you can't be upset now that we've uncovered that 9 of the 11 were naturalized American citizens. Who could possibly object to Americans lynching other Americans? Well, after a while, the saber rattling sort of dissipated, but there was always this sort of feeling that Southern and Eastern Europeans were not like Americans. In fact, by 1915, you would have a movement to restrict the immigration of Southern and Eastern Europeans. That while they were white, they were kind of an off-white. They were less. They were inferior to Northern Europeans. That was the way that John C. Lodge and others who had come from old Anglo-Saxon families looked at it. And then there were Jewish Americans. The Orthodox Jews dressed differently. They had a different religion. They didn't go out of their way to mix with the American people. They spoke Yiddish. And if the Italians, think about it, many of the Southern Eastern Europeans came with a religion that nobody liked in America at the time. They were what? They were Catholics. How dare they bring with them popism? The Americans screamed and wouldn't give it up and become good Protestants. So this in itself creates tensions within the cities, these new sources of immigrants. But in terms of the immigrants who came to America from Southern and Eastern European countries, they really couldn't speak English. It was difficult for them to find jobs and places to live. But the cities at this period, during the last part of the 19th century, were controlled. I should point out, there was one other group that was also singled out, and that was the Chinese Americans. And in fact, the Chinese Americans were the only group in which Congress passed a law, the Chinese Exclusion Act in 1881, to temporarily halt the immigration of Chinese to America. And that the Chinese Exclusion Act would be modified and renewed several times. So they were the only group that was actually prohibited by congressional action. They encountered difficulty in the West Coast where they were concentrated. The Southern Eastern Europeans encountered difficulty in the cities in the East and Midwest. But in these cities you had corruption. Political corruption in many ways was the way business was done in the cities during the last part of the 19th century. Political corruption. Many of the large cities like New York were run by bosses. The most flamboyant was Boss Tweed, William Marcy of New York. The bosses of these cities divided the cities into wards. And their hand-picked men would often meet immigrants as they came off the boat. They would meet them ostensibly to lend a helping hand to these new arriving immigrants from Europe. Understanding they did not speak English and were not aware of American customs and values, they were there to help. So they would often find them a place to live. They would bring with them perhaps a basket of fruit. They would often find them a job. Now, the only thing the children, not aware of American laws, would often run afoul of the law. And when that happened, they ran to the nearest ward boss or alderman, whoever it might be. And he intervened on behalf of the immigrant's child. He didn't know any better. I mean, again, the jungle, you see what happens in terms of juvenile delinquency. The only thing the bosses asked in return was what? Well, loyalty more than money. Because with loyalty comes money, I think. Just give us your vote. Even if you can't speak English, just put your X somewhere. They literally bought their votes. I mean, and if you were an immigrant from a foreign country, obviously you were bewildered. It was difficult to really understand for a while until you had become really acculturated to the American scene how to distinguish between what was right and what was wrong politically. So they were able to use the immigrants this way. Corruption. You could see corruption. We talked about William Marcy, Boss Cox. I mean, whoa. Boss Cox did things in a big way. He established for New York his own stationery company in the 1870s. And he charged the city for one ream of paper. Now, one ream of paper is 500 sheets, which if you go to one of the stores around here will cost you approximately, at the most, even good quality, about $5. He charged the city of New York for one ream of paper $10,000. And then there was a practice called boodling. It's a strange term, boodling. It was the selling of municipal franchises. The selling of municipal franchises by city councilmen. And what I mean by that is simply this. When someone wanted to control transportation for a city, the trolley service, and you had to have, and they gave it in terms of a monopoly to one individual. The individual simply paid the councilman in exchange for the right to run the trolley service or the transportation service or the gas and light service, the same one. The same thing happened. You simply paid councilmen, and they voted to what? To give it to you. Councilmen sometimes could become rich by boodling. One of America's most formidable senators that we'll talk about, Nelson Aldrich of Rhode Island, will become a millionaire as a result of boodling during his younger years in the city of Newport, Rhode Island. And then you had police payroll padding. You know, you had policemen who falsified payroll records. They had policemen who actually had protection rings. It was not the gangsters often in the 1880s, 1890s that Americans had to worry about. It was the policemen themselves. They would extract a protection fee. But these things, again, are not new. We've always had these, as far back as we can go in terms of cities, but they became increasingly a problem because of the growth of the cities themselves. The cities themselves were just terrible. They grew up overnight, basically, with no regulation. There were virtually no state codes that regulated the building of tenements and the building of factories. You could build a factory or a tenement virtually anywhere you wanted and however you wanted. A book that was published at the turn of the century talks about what it was like to live in the cities. The tenements. Jacob Riis, How the Other Half Lives. You should really get a copy of this. It is as poignant as Upton Sinclair's The Jungle, and it's strictly an historical account. He talks about the congestion. He talks about how the tenements were really extraordinarily huge barracks. They were fiery furnaces in the summer. They were places of disease that bred communicable disease. Tuberculosis became one of the most dreaded diseases at the turn of the century. Fires because of lack of safety. No one had to install safety devices. I'll talk about it in a moment, but for instance, let me give you an example. We'll go back to this. In 1911, there was the Triangle Waist Shirt fire. I think I'll get back to it in a moment. Well, I'll get back to it. But let me just talk about it. The Triangle Waist Shirt fire. It just came up. I need to talk about it now to illustrate this point. It was a company in New York in 1911 which employed almost all women. When the women entered the factory, it was a sewing factory. Women were first checked as they went in. They were searched. And they were almost virtually strip searched when they left to make sure that they did not what? Bring home thread, bring home pieces of material that they could make their own clothes at home. There were some factories in which people were actually chained to the workstation. They could not go into the restroom without a supervisor going in and accompanying them to make sure they were not putting a roll of thread somewhere on their body. We won't go into where. This is a family hour. Not when this, well. But most, they had to eat their lunch at their machines. But worst of all, they were told that the doors that were marked safety exits in case of a fire were in working order, when in fact these doors did not really exist. There were no safety exits. No one had come to check to make sure they were up to code, that they were following some sort of state or city ordinances. So a fire broke out. And as the women rushed to these safety exits, they found they were chained, that there were really no doors. And as they crushed one another trying to get out through the one door that led into the factory, most women decided to take their chances and jump from the windows. More than 100 women died in the Triangle Waist Shirt fire. Many leaping to their death. The cities were not pleasant places to be. And particularly, it seemed as if those who ran the cities could not comprehend that they had a phenomenon that was occurring, this increase in terms of population growth that needed serious attention, and they did not prepare for it. And there was a strange sort of, before the transition was made, before laws were passed to regulate tenements and buildings and factories, the cost in lives and disease and injury and death was incredible. Samuel Gompers, I spoke of Samuel Gompers a moment ago, the head of the American Federation of Labor. He worked, now, how would you like this? He worked in the cigar, tobacco making factory tenements. He actually worked and slept in the same rooms. In one room, he would take damp, wet tobacco, and he would roll it into cigars. The dampness in itself was incredibly unhealthy. And then he would go into the next room to sleep. Naturally, Gompers never forgot what that was like to live in the cities. Now, Jacob Riis does a wonderful job in describing. It creates disease. You could even, in the 1880s, in the 1890s, in major cities, there was still outdoor plumbing in the 1890s. Can you imagine outdoor plumbing in the 1890s in big tenement buildings? And by outdoor plumbing, I don't mean real plumbing. If you've ever grown up in a farm, you know what I'm talking about. As a young kid, my father used to take us to the country, Danville, Kentucky. We were city kids from Cincinnati. We didn't know anything about the country. And we went to visit my great-grandmother. And it was night. And it was getting night. It was actually the first time it was getting dark. I mean, it gets dark in the country too. I mean, oof. We had to use the restroom. And I looked all over my great-grandmother's house, as modest as it was, and I couldn't find a separate bathroom. I looked, because I had to go. And she just pointed. She pointed back. I kept wondering, where's Grandma pointing? She said, the bathroom is about 500 yards that way. So I became acquainted for the first time with outdoor plumbing, or the outhouse, which I just found so realistic. I mean, why would you have two seats? I had questions I could not answer. Why would you have old phone books and newspapers instead of Charmin? That was when I was a kid. But here you have the cities in which people had outhouses. Sometimes they didn't even bother with outhouses. In certain cities, particularly St. Louis and some others in Baltimore, in the 1880s and 90s, they would still throw their refuge out of the window and let the hogs eat it. Yeah, I would too. I would. She's grimacing. I would too. No wonder you had epidemics of cholera, tuberculosis, and fires in the cities at the turn of the century. This again becomes a reason for the progressive movement. And then you had things like prostitution. Now, prostitution. Again, that's always been a problem. And I want to, this is a progressive who I'll talk about again in a moment. But I think I want to talk about him now because he had a very interesting way of dealing with prostitution, how to clean it up. Maybe some of our city officials could take a page from this mayor. He was the mayor of that great metropolis, Toledo, Ohio. He was Samuel Golden Rule Jones. Now, he was called Golden Rule Jones, or Golden Rule, because he believed that every problem in a city, this was the mayor, could be solved by simply applying the golden rule to every situation. Do unto others as you would have them do unto you. The golden rule is show love, extend love. That was the way to turn crime around, to take a bite out of crime, if you will. Well, he came up with, and consistent with his philosophy, he came up with a program to get rid of prostitution in Toledo. I could characterize it as take a prostitute home with you. He actually told city council that his program was that he asked every minister in the town that we have women out here who need love and guidance. And so he asked the ministers if they would show that love and guidance by taking a prostitute home with them and turn them around on the right path. Well, somehow the wives of the ministers, they did not find that it was such a good idea. For some reason, I can't fathom why. So his plan died. So prostitution continued in Toledo, Ohio. Well, all of these, labor, the cities, the farmers, all had their grievances. By the turn of the century, it was clear that many felt that in spite of the benefits of the Industrial Revolution, there were some serious problems that had to be addressed. There had to be someone who would be able to be an advocate for labor, because the labor was obviously unable to affect change for itself. There had to be an advocate for the cities and an advocate for the farmers. So what you will have beginning in 1900 will be known as either the progressive era or the progressive movement. The progressive movement will have three aims that we will talk about the next time we meet. But very quickly, those three aims will be good government, anti-monopoly, and social justice. We'll look at the progressive movement when we meet the next time.